Imagine you're on a crashing airplane, right?
Yeah.
And suddenly the oxygen masks drop from the ceiling.
Oh, man. Never a good situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But we all know the golden rule, right? You secure your own mask first before you try to help the person sitting next to you.
Right, because, I mean, you can't save anyone else if you're suffocating.
Exactly. And welcome to this deep dive, where today we are in full war room briefing mode, because we're looking at why India just officially decided to put its own oxygen mask on first when it comes to the global climate crisis.
It's a massive shift in how we think about environmental policy. And if you are tracking this for national strategy or exam prep, you need to pay close attention.
Yeah, because for years, the global conversation has been, entirely focused on collective action. Everyone's sacrificing together to lower the temperature of the entire cabin.
Right. But what we are analyzing today is a very deliberate, calculated pivot, a strategic recalibration by India.
And we're basing this on a huge stack of recent government documents, policy papers, economic surveys. The through line is just undeniable. India is formally shifting its primary focus away from climate mitigation.
Which, just to be clear, means cutting carbon emissions to stop global warming.
Right, shifting away from that and moving aggressively toward climate adaptation, which basically means, the heat is coming, let's build the resilience we need to survive it right now.
Exactly. And we really have to look at the background layer here, the trigger events that are forcing this shift. Because this isn't India just randomly deciding to abandon global climate goals.
No, not at all. The structural problem here is that the global momentum on climate change is, well, frankly, it's collapsing. The sources are pretty brutal about this.
Complete failure of global cooperation. First off, developed nations, the ones who historically put the vast majority of the carbon into the atmosphere, are broadly missing their 2030 and 2035 emission reduction targets.
Right.
But more importantly for developing nations, the developed world has almost completely failed to meet its climate finance obligations.
That's a huge point. The money that was promised to help nations transition to green energy, it simply hasn't materialized in any meaningful way, has it?
Not at all. And then there's the elephant in the room, the impending withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Agreement in 2025.
Wow. Yeah, 2025. Which completely shatters the foundational premise of mitigation, right?
Yeah.
Because mitigation only works if everyone cooperates.
Exactly. If the biggest historical emitters are walking away from the table or, failing to pay their promised share, a developing country faces a stark choice.
Yeah. Do you continue to restrict your own economic growth to meet top-down international mandates that literally no one else is following? Or do you focus on your own survival?
Exactly. So going back to your airplane analogy, if the pilots are abandoning the cockpit and half the passengers are refusing to wear their masks, why should India restrict its own industrial engine to try and save the plane?
It makes complete sense when you frame it around sheer survival.
Uh.
And let's look at the hard data, because you need these facts anchored in your memory. The Economic Survey for 2024-25 makes this priority incredibly explicit.
Yes, it states that achieving developed country status by 2047 takes absolute precedence. That is the North Star.
2047, Viksit Bharat.
Right. And the underlying argument is that rapid industrialization is what provides the actual economic resources, the raw capital, that's necessary to afford future decarbonization.
Okay, I really want to dig into that difference between mitigation and adaptation, because the source material makes a fascinating distinction, and I think we often blur the two together when we just talk about climate action.
It's a crucial distinction to make. Mitigation is about treating the root cause of the disease, avoiding and reducing emissions of heat-trapping greenhouse gases.
So we're talking about transitioning national grids to solar and wind, or utilizing carbon capture technologies, right?
Right. Or protecting massive forests so they act as carbon sinks. But the catch, and the sources heavily emphasize this, is the timeline.
Because if you shut down a coal plant today, you don't feel the cooling effect tomorrow.
Exactly. Mitigation actions take decades to actually affect rising temperatures globally. It's a very long-term play. Adaptation, on the other hand, is altering human behavior, systems, and ways of life to protect societies right now.
So if mitigation is trying to stop the storm, adaptation is basically building a better umbrella.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so let's paint a picture of what that actually looks like. What is an adaptation umbrella in policy terms?
It's highly localized. It means pouring concrete to build sea level rise defenses around a vulnerable coastal city, or redesigning bridges to handle extreme weather that's already happening.
Right, or fundamentally changing the crops farmers plant because the monsoons are no longer predictable.
Exactly. Adaptation provides immediate, tangible protection for society in the foreseeable future.
So it's shifting away from those massive top-down international mandates, like someone in a Geneva conference room telling you exactly how many tons of coal you can burn.
Right. Shifting to a localized, bottom-up approach.
Let's talk about how the government is actually executing this. Because our research outlines a massive structural framework. We've got the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which is built on 8 priority national missions.
And look, we don't need to run through all 8 like a laundry list. But looking closely at a few of them reveals exactly how this bottom-up adaptation works on the ground.
Okay, what's a good example?
Take the National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture, arguably the most critical for immediate survival.
Because obviously if the food supply fails, everything else collapses.
Precisely. And this mission isn't focused on, say, reducing the carbon footprint of tractors. It is obsessively focused on devising strategies for food security in a warmer world.
So like crop diversification.
Yes. How do you implement crop diversification in a region that used to get predictable rainfall but now swings wildly between drought and flooding? How do you enhance the livelihoods of farmers so one bad harvest doesn't financially ruin an entire district?
Oh, wow. So it's about building national economic stability in the face of very real present-day climate risks.
Exactly.
Another one that stood out in our notes was the National Mission for Sustaining the Himalayan Ecosystem. And what fascinated me is just how hyper-specific it is.
Right. It's not a generic environmental law.
No, it's focused entirely on understanding the incredibly complex, localized processes of the Himalayas. You've got glacial melt, shifting weather patterns affecting downstream agriculture.
And the adaptation measures required there are completely different from what you need in coastal Kerala or urban Mumbai, which highlights exactly why the bottom-up approach is so necessary.
Right. You just cannot govern a continent-sized ecosystem with a one-size-fits-all climate mandate.
Exactly. We see this with the National Water Mission, too, which focuses heavily on conservation and equitable distribution. Or the National Mission on Sustainable Habitat, which tackles urban planning.
Yeah, like how do you redesign a megacity's public transport and manage solid waste so that a sudden deluge of rain doesn't result in a catastrophic disease outbreak?
Precisely. Now, when we look at these missions, something interesting comes up in the timeline. The sources mention the Jawaharlal Nehru National Solar Mission.
Right, GNSM.
Right, and the fact that it set a target of 20,000 megawatts of clean energy capacity way back by 2022. So India has been building green infrastructure for a while.
Okay, so the transition to renewables has been ongoing. The shift we're talking about isn't about abandoning green energy.
No, not at all. It's about the motivation behind it. Building solar capacity isn't just about reducing carbon parts per million anymore. It's about energy independence and resilience.
I see. It's about not being reliant on volatile global energy markets. That actually brings me to the most surprising part of the research we went through.
What's that?
Well, when I think of climate policy, I think of solar panels, wind turbines, maybe electric buses. But the source material explicitly links climate adaptation to rural and social governance programs that don't sound like climate policies at all.
Ah, yes. This is where the strategy becomes incredibly sophisticated. Let's look at programs like the PM Gram Sadak Yojana. That's the massive national initiative to build all-weather roads in rural areas.
Right. Or the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which provides guaranteed wage employment. On the surface, that's rural development. How is building a dirt and gravel road a climate adaptation strategy?
Because it builds structural resilience. Let's say you have a remote farming community. If a massive climate-induced flood wipes out their crops and they only have a dirt path connecting them to the rest of the world,
They're trapped.
exactly. They are trapped. They face starvation, extreme poverty, and dislocation. But if you've built an all-weather road, a structural piece of adaptation, those individuals now have economic mobility.
So they can travel to a nearby town to find temporary work.
Right. The road acts as a safety net. It allows them to survive the climate shock without falling into generational poverty.
Wow, okay. The source material actually says the goal of these initiatives is the, quote, effective delinking of energy sector growth from economic growth.
It's about separating human well-being from carbon emissions. And it goes even deeper into social governance. The documents detail how they were building psychosocial support into the climate strategy.
Psychosocial support. Wait, like mental health and community support.
Yes, life skills training, conflict resolution, and safety net interventions specifically designed to prevent child exploitation and the trauma of dislocation.
That's heavy.
It is. Because when climate disasters strike, it's not just infrastructure that breaks down. Society breaks down. People are forced to migrate. Resources become scarce. And vulnerable populations are suddenly at high risk of exploitation.
So preparing communities psychologically and socially for that stress is a massive part of climate adaptation. We're not just adapting the physical environment. We are literally adapting the society itself to withstand the incoming shocks.
Exactly. That is a radically different way of looking at climate action than just measuring greenhouse gases. Which brings us to the most controversial and arguably the most significant policy stance we found in the data.
Right, the economic survey for 2025.
Yes. It proposed a very explicit division of labor on the global stage. The proposition is this: the rich developed countries should take on the burden of mitigation work, while developing countries focus entirely on adaptation.
Okay, wait, I have to push back on this.
Go for it.
Because we just spent the first part of this deep dive establishing that developed nations are fundamentally failing their climate finance obligations. We know the U.S. is pulling out of the Paris Agreement in 2025.
Right.
If we already know the developed world is failing at its promises, isn't relying on them to handle global mitigation a massive strategic vulnerability?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, if they fail to lower global emissions, the temperatures keep rising and the storms keep getting worse, regardless of how well India builds its seawalls or its rural roads.
It is an enormous strategic vulnerability. You're absolutely right to point that out. It's a calculated gamble. However, the government's rationale balances this vulnerability against an immediate existential threat.
Which is?
The stalling of its own economic growth.
Yeah.
Because if India restricts its own fossil fuel use right now to try and mitigate global emissions...
It essentially halts its own industrialization.
Exactly. Think about it. Without rapid industrialization, there is no wealth generation.
Right.
Without immense national wealth, you cannot afford to build those seawalls. You cannot afford advanced agricultural tech.
Right. You can't afford to eventually transition your own massive grid to green energy. So it's a catch-22.
It's a huge catch-22. Relying on the West for mitigation is incredibly risky, but stifling domestic economic growth is viewed as catastrophic. If you are poor when the worst climate shocks hit, you simply will not survive.
Right.
Poverty is the greatest vulnerability to climate change.
Which means this entire policy shift really isn't just about the environment. It's a defense strategy.
Yes. It is the ultimate manifestation of strategic autonomy. When India refuses externally imposed energy transition targets, it is asserting its national sovereignty and its fundamental right to industrialize.
The sources actually cite China's model here, which I found fascinating. The idea is that China utilized an era of rapid, highly carbon-intensive industrial growth first. They became the factory of the world.
Exactly.
And they used that phase to generate immense historic levels of capital. And now they're using that massive wealth as a precursor to future decarbonization.
Yeah.
They're leading the world in solar panel manufacturing and EV production.
Right. India is looking at that and saying, we need that wealth generation phase first. And that ties directly into the concept of Viksit Bharat 2047.
Right, the national drive to achieve fully developed nation status by the centenary of independence. So what we are seeing is that climate policy is no longer functioning in a silo.
No, it is a core pillar of economic defense and supply chain resilience. Economic development is the primary defense mechanism against climate change, because wealth is the armor.
Wealth is the armor. I like that. If you have capital, you can engineer solutions. If you don't, you are at the mercy of the elements.
Exactly. Now, for those listening who are preparing to write on this, whether it's for an exam, a policy brief, or strategic analysis, we need to convert this into a solid answer framework.
Okay, yeah. Let's do the answer writing conversion. How do we structure this?
Okay, if you're writing a 250-word analysis, start with the context. Point directly to the global failure in climate finance and the U.S. Paris Agreement withdrawal in 2025. That's your intro.
Okay, context is the global failure. Then what?
Then move to the dimensions. This is where you explain the shift from mitigation to adaptation. Cite the bottom-up approach and list a couple of the 8 national missions as examples. Mention JN, NSM, and sustainable agriculture.
Got it. And then we have discussed the limitations, right?
Right, the challenges. You must evaluate the policy critically Discuss the tension between balancing economic prosperity, Viksit Ferret, 2047, with environmental responsibility, especially without external funding.
And what's the conclusion? The way forward?
For the conclusion, you summarize the Economic Survey 2025 doctrine. Developing nations adapt, developed nations mitigate. Emphasize that institutional strengthening and technological adoption are required to make this work.
That is a perfect high-scoring framework. Intro, dimensions, challenges, conclusion. Love it.
Let's lock this in with a final revision capsule.
Mm-hmm.
We need to drill down the core takeaways.
Okay, give me the 5 must-remember facts.
Number 1, the U.S. Paris Agreement withdrawal in 2025. Number 2, the Economic Survey 2024-25 prioritizing developed status by 2047.
Viksit Bharat.
Exactly. Number 3, the Economic Survey 2025 proposing rich nations mitigate while developing nations adapt. Number 4, the structural framework is the 8 national emissions.
And number 5?
Number 5, the JNNSM's historic target of 20,000 megawatts by 2022, proving the ongoing transition.
Perfect. Now, what's a probable exam question or essay prompt based on all this?
Expect something like, critically analyze India's shift from climate mitigation to adaptation in the context of strategic autonomy and global climate finance failures.
That's a great question. And to answer it, you'd need the 5 analytical keywords we discussed. Let's list them.
Right. Write these down. Strategic recalibration. Bottom-up approach. Adaptation first. Energy transition autonomy. And structural resilience.
Okay, let's bring it all home. Can you give us a 30-second summary of everything we've talked about?
Absolutely. India is actively rejecting top-down global climate mandates that hinder its economic growth. By focusing on immediate local adaptation and rapid industrialization, India is building the economic wealth necessary to afford future decarbonization on its own terms.
It's honestly a fascinating, almost ruthless pragmatism. The strategy is essentially to run fast enough to build the shelter before the storm fully hits.
It is a calculated gamble on economic velocity outpacing environmental degradation.
Which leaves us with a pretty heavy question to think about long after this deep dive ends. We've established this strategy, right? Put your own oxygen mask on first, build the national wealth, and use that wealth as armor. But if economic wealth is India's chosen armor against climate change, what happens when localized climate disasters start destroying the very infrastructure meant to generate that wealth long before we ever reach 2047?
Yeah, that is the true race against time.
Something to really keep an eye on as these policies play out on the ground. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the shifting currents of global climate strategy. We'll see you next time.